Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Carlos Castaneda. Book 2. Task of Seeing. Working on my notes, I had come across various questions. Is the green fog, like the guardian, something that one has to overcome in order to see? I asked Don Juan as soon as we sat down under his ramada on August 8, 1969. Yes. One must overcome everything, he said. How can I overcome the green fog? The same way you should have overcome the guardian, by letting it turn into nothing. What should I do? Nothing. For you, the green fog is something much easier than the guardian. The spirit of the water hole likes you, while it certainly was not your temperament to deal with the guardian. You never really saw the guardian. Maybe that was because I didn't like it. What if I were to meet a guardian I liked? There must be some people who would regard the guardian I saw as being beautiful. Would they overcome it because they liked it? No. You still don't understand. It doesn't matter whether you like or dislike the guardian. As long as you have a feeling toward it, the guardian will remain the same, monstrous, beautiful, or whatever. If you have no feeling toward it, on the other hand, the guardian will become nothing and will still be there in front of you. The idea that something as colossal as the guardian could become nothing and still be in front of my eyes made absolutely no sense. I felt it was one of the illogical premises of Don Juan's knowledge. However, I also felt that if he wanted to, he could explain it to me. I insisted on asking him what he meant by that. You thought the guardian was something you knew, that's what I mean. But I didn't think it was something I knew. You thought it was ugly. Its size was awesome. It was a monster. You know what all those things are. So the guardian was always something you knew, and as long as it was something you knew, you did not see it. I have told you already, the guardian had to become nothing, and yet it had to stand in front of you. It had to be there and it had, at the same time, to be nothing. How could that be, Don Juan? What you say is absurd. It is. But that is seeing. There is really no way to talk about it. Seeing, as I said before, is learned by seeing. Apparently you have no problem with water. You nearly saw it the other day. Water is your hinge. All you need now is to perfect your technique of seeing. You have a powerful helper in the spirit of the water hole. That's another burning question I have, Don Juan. You may have all the burning questions you want, but we cannot talk about the spirit of the water hole in this vicinity. In fact, it is better not to think about it at all. Not at all. Otherwise the spirit will trap you, and if that happens, there is nothing a living man can do to help you. So keep your mouth shut and keep your thoughts on something else. Around 10 o'clock the next morning, Don Juan took his pipe out of its sheath, filled it with smoking mixture, then handed it to me, and told me to carry it to the bank of the stream. Holding the pipe with both hands, I managed to unbutton my shirt and put the pipe inside and hold it tight. Don Juan carried 2 straw mats and a small tray with coals. It was a warm day. We sat on the mats in the shade of a small grove of brea trees at the very edge of the water. Don Juan placed a charcoal inside the pipe bowl and told me to smoke. I did not have any apprehension or any feeling of elation. I remembered that during my second attempt to see the guardian, after Don Juan had explained its nature, I had had a unique sensation of wonder and awe. This time, however, although Don Juan had made me cognizant of the possibility of actually seeing the water, I was not involved emotionally, I was only curious. Don Juan made me smoke twice the amount I had smoked during previous attempts. At a given moment he leaned over and whispered in my right ear that he was going to teach me how to use the water in order to move. I felt his face very close, as if he had put his mouth next to my ear. He told me not to gaze into the water, but to focus my eyes on the surface and keep them fixed until the water turned into a green fog. He repeated over and over that I had to put all my attention on the fog until I could not detect anything else. "Look at the water in front of you," I heard him saying, "but don't let its sound carry you anywhere. If you let the sound of the water carry you, I may never be able to find you and bring you back. Now get into the green fog and listen to my voice." I remained suspended in it until a very sharp, sustained, shrill noise shook everything. The fog seemed to congeal into the usual features of the water surface. The shrill noise was Don Juan yelling, "Hey!" close to my ear. He told me to pay attention to his voice and go back into the fog and wait there until he called me. I said, in English, and heard the cackling noise of his laughter. "Please, don't talk," he said. "Don't give me any more." I could hear him very well. The sound of his voice was melodious and above all friendly. I knew that without thinking. It was a conviction that struck me and then passed. Don Juan's voice ordered me to focus all my attention on the fog, but not abandon myself to it. He said repeatedly that a warrior did not abandon himself to anything, not even to his death. I became immersed in the mist again and noticed that it was not fog at all, or at least it was not what I conceive fog to be like. The fog-like phenomenon was composed of tiny bubbles, round objects that came into my field of vision and moved out of it with a floating quality. I watched their movement for a while, then a loud distant noise jolted my attention, and I lost my capacity to focus and could no longer perceive the tiny bubbles. All I was aware of then was a green, amorphous, fog-like glow. I heard the loud noise again, and the jolt it gave dispelled the fog at once, and I found myself looking at the water of the irrigation ditch. Then I heard it again much closer. It was Don Juan's voice. He was telling me to pay attention to him, because his voice was my only guide. He ordered me to look at the bank of the stream and at the vegetation directly in front of me. I saw some reeds and a space which was clear of reeds. It was a small cove on the bank, a place where Don Juan steps across to plunge his bucket and fill it with water. After a few moments, Don Juan ordered me to return to the fog and asked me again to pay attention to his voice, because he was going to guide me so I could learn how to move. He said that once I saw the bubbles, I should board one of them and let it carry me. I obeyed him and was at once surrounded by the green mist, and then I saw the tiny bubbles. I heard Don Juan's voice again as a very strange and frightening rumble. Immediately upon hearing it, I began losing my capacity to perceive the bubbles. "Mount one of those bubbles," I heard him saying. I struggled to maintain my perception of the green bubbles and still hear his voice. I don't know how long I fought to do that, when suddenly I was aware that I could listen to him and still keep sight of the bubbles, which kept on passing through, floating slowly out of my field of perception. Don Juan's voice kept on urging me to follow one of them and mount it. I wondered how I was supposed to do that, and automatically I voiced the word, "How?" I felt that the word was very deep inside me, and as it came out it carried me to the surface. The word was like a buoy that emerged out of my depth. I heard myself saying, "How," and I sounded like a dog howling. Don Juan howled back, also like a dog, and then he made some coyote sounds and laughed. I thought it was very funny and I actually laughed. Don Juan told me very calmly to let myself become affixed to a bubble by following it. "Go back again," he said. "Go into the fog. Into the fog." I went back and noticed that the movement of the bubbles had slowed down, and they had become as large as basketballs. In fact, they were so large and slow that I could examine any one of them in great detail. They were not really bubbles, not like a soap bubble, nor like a balloon, nor any spherical container. They were not containers, yet they were contained. Nor were they round, although when I first perceived them I could have sworn they were round, and the image that came to my mind was bubbles. I viewed them as if I were looking through a window, that is, the frame of the window did not allow me to follow them, but only permitted me to view them coming into and going out of my field of perception. When I ceased to view them as bubbles, however, I was capable of following them. In the act of following them, I became affixed to one of them, and I floated with it. I truly felt I was moving. In fact, I was the bubble, or that thing which resembled a bubble. Then I heard the shrill sound of Don Juan's voice. It jolted me and I lost my feeling of being it. The sound was extremely frightening. It was a remote voice, very metallic, as if he were talking through a loudspeaker. I made out some of the words. "Look at the banks," he said. I saw a very large body of water. The water was rushing. I could hear the noise it made. "Look at the banks," Don Juan ordered me again. I saw a concrete wall. The sound of the water became terribly loud. The sound engulfed me. Then it ceased instantaneously, as if it had been cut off. I had the sensation of blackness, of sleep. I became aware that I was immersed in the irrigation ditch. Don Juan was splashing water in my face as he hummed. Then he submerged me in the ditch. He pulled my head up over the surface and let me rest it on the bank as he held me by the back of my shirt collar. I had a most pleasant sensation in my arms and legs. I stretched them. My eyes were tired and they itched. I lifted my right hand to rub them. It was a difficult movement. My arm seemed to be heavy. I could hardly lift it out of the water, but when I did, my arm came out covered with a most astonishing mass of green mist. I held my arm in front of my eyes. I could see its contour as a darker mass of green, surrounded by a most intense greenish glow. I got to my feet in a hurry and stood in the middle of the stream and looked at my body. My chest, arms, and legs were green, deep green. The hue was so intense that it gave me the feeling of a viscous substance. I looked like a figurine Don Juan had made for me years before out of a datura root. Don Juan told me to come out. I noticed an urgency in his voice. "I'm green," I said. "Cut it out," he said imperatively. "You have no time. Get out of there. The water is about to trap you. Get out of it. Out. Out." I panicked and jumped out. "This time you must tell me everything that took place," he said matter-of-factly, as soon as we sat facing each other inside his room. He was not interested in the sequence of my experience. He wanted to know only what I had encountered when he told me to look at the bank. He was interested in details. I described the wall I had seen. Was the wall to your left or to your right? He asked. I told him that the wall had really been in front of me. But he insisted that it had to be either to the left or to the right. When you first saw it, where was it? Close your eyes and don't open them until you have remembered. He stood up and turned my body while I had my eyes closed until he had me facing east, the same direction I had faced when I was sitting in front of the stream. He asked me in which direction I had moved. I said I had moved onward, ahead, in front of me. He insisted that I should remember and concentrate on the tune when I was still viewing the water as bubbles. Which way did they flow? He asked. Don Juan urged me to recall, and finally I had to admit that the bubbles had seemed to be moving to my right. Yet I was not as absolutely sure as he wanted me to be. Under his probing I began to realize that I was incapable of classifying my perception. The bubbles had moved to my right when I first viewed them, but when they became larger they flowed everywhere. Some of them seemed to be coming directly at me, others seemed to go in every possible direction. There were bubbles moving above and below me. In fact, they were all around me. I recollected hearing their fizzing, thus I must have perceived them with my ears as well as with my eyes. When the bubbles became so large that I was able to mount one of them, I saw them rubbing each other like balloons. My excitement increased as I recollected the details of my perception. Don Juan, however, was completely uninterested. I told him that I had seen the bubbles fizzing. It was not a purely auditory or purely visual effect, but something undifferentiated, yet crystal clear. The bubbles rasped against each other. I did not see or hear their movement, I felt it. I was part of the sound and the motion. As I recounted my experience, I became deeply moved. I held his arm and shook it in an outburst of great agitation. I had realized that the bubbles had no outer limit. Nonetheless, they were contained and their edges changed shape and were uneven and jagged. The bubbles merged and separated with great speed, yet their movement was not dazzling. Their movement was fast and at the same time slow. Another thing I remembered as I recounted my experience was the quality of color that the bubbles seemed to possess. They were transparent and very bright and seemed almost green, although it was not a hue, as I am accustomed to perceiving hues. You're stalling, Don Juan said. Those things are not important. You're dwelling on the wrong items. The direction is the only important issue. I could only remember that I had moved without any point of reference, but Don Juan concluded that since the bubbles had flowed consistently to my right south at the beginning, the south was the direction with which I had to be concerned. He again urged me imperatively to recollect whether the wall was to my right or my left. I strained to remember. When Don Juan called me and I surfaced, so to speak, I think I had the wall to my left. I was very close to it and was able to distinguish the grooves and protuberances of the wooden armature or mold into which the concrete had been poured. Very thin strips of wood had been used, and the pattern they had created was compact. The wall was very high. One end of it was visible to me, and I noticed that it did not have a corner, but curved around. He sat in silence for a moment, as if he were thinking how to decipher the meaning of my experience. He finally said that I had not accomplished a great deal, that I had fallen short of what he expected me to do. What was I supposed to do? He did not answer, but made a puckering gesture with his lips. You did very well, he said. Today you learned that a brujo uses the water to move. But did I see? He looked at me with a curious expression. He rolled his eyes and said that I had to go into the green mist a good many times until I could answer that question myself. He changed the direction of our conversation in a subtle way, saying I had not really learned how to move using the water, but I had learned that a brujo could do that, and he had deliberately told me to look at the bank of the stream so I could check my movement. You moved very fast, he said, as fast as a man who knows how to perform this technique. I had a hard time keeping up with you. I begged him to explain what had happened to me from the beginning. He laughed, shaking his head slowly as though in disbelief. You always insist on knowing things from the beginning, he said. But there's no beginning. The beginning is only in your thought. I think the beginning was when I sat on the bank and smoked, I said. But before you smoked I had to figure out what to do with you, he said. I would have to tell you what I did and I can't do that because it would take me to still another point. So perhaps things would be clearer to you if you didn't think about beginnings. Then tell me what happened after I sat on the bank and smoked. I think you have told me that already, he said, laughing. Was anything I did of any importance, Don Juan? He shrugged his shoulders. You followed my directions very well and had no problem getting into and out of the fog. Then you listened to my voice and returned to the surface every time I called you. That was the exercise. The rest was very easy. You simply let the fog carry you. You behaved as though you knew what to do. When you were very far away I called you again and made you look at the bank, so you would know how far you had gone. Then I pulled you back. You mean, Don Juan, that I really traveled in the water? You did. And very far too. How far? You wouldn't believe it. I tried to coax him into telling me, but he dropped the subject and said he had to leave for a while. I insisted that he should at least give me a hint. I don't like to be kept in the dark, I said. You keep yourself in the dark, he said. Think about the wall you saw. Sit down here on your mat and remember every detail of it. Then perhaps you yourself may discover how far you went. All I know now is that you traveled very far. I know that because I had a terrible time pulling you back. If I had not been around, you might have wandered off and never returned, in which case all that would be left of you now would be your dead body on the side of the stream. Or perhaps you might have returned by yourself. With you I'm not sure. So judging by the effort it took me to bring you back, I'd say you were clearly in. He made a long pause. He stared at me in a friendly way. I would go as far as the mountains of central Mexico, he said. I don't know how far you would go, perhaps as far as Los Angeles, or perhaps even as far as Brazil. Don Juan returned the next day late in the afternoon. In the meantime I had written down everything I could recollect about my perception. While I wrote, it occurred to me to follow the banks up and down the stream in each direction and corroborate whether I had actually seen a feature on either side that might have elicited in me the image of a wall. I conjectured that Don Juan might have made me walk in a state of stupor and then might have made me focus my attention on some wall on the way. In the hours that elapsed between the tune I first detected the fog and the time I got out of the ditch and went back to his house, I calculated that if he had made me walk, we could have walked, at the most, 2.5 miles. So I followed the banks of the stream for about 3 miles in each direction, carefully observing every feature which might have been pertinent to my vision of the wall. The stream was, as far as I could tell, a plain canal used for irrigation. It was 4 to 5 feet wide throughout its length, and I could not find any visible features in it that would have reminded me or forced the image of a concrete wall. When Don Juan arrived at his house in the late afternoon, I accosted him and insisted on reading my account to HTM. He refused to listen and made me sit down. He sat facing me. He was not smiling. He seemed to be thinking, judging by the penetrating look in his eyes, which were fixed above the horizon. "I think you must be aware by now," he said in a tone that was suddenly very severe, "that everything is mortally dangerous. The water is as deadly as the guardian. If you don't watch out, the water will trap you. It nearly did that yesterday. But in order to be trapped, a man has to be willing. There's your trouble. You're willing to abandon yourself." I did not know what he was talking about. His attack on me had been so sudden that I was disoriented. I feebly asked him to explain himself. He reluctantly mentioned that he had gone to the water canyon and had seen the spirit of the water hole and had the profound conviction I had flubbed my chances to see the water. "How?" I asked, truly baffled. "The spirit is a force," he said, "and as such, it responds only to strength. You cannot indulge in its presence." "When did I indulge?" "Yesterday, when you became green in the water." "I did not indulge. I thought it was a very important moment and I told you what was happening to me." "Who are you to think or decide what is important? You know nothing about the forces you're tapping. The spirit of the water hole exists out there and could have helped you. In fact, it was helping you until you flubbed it. Now I don't know what will be the outcome of your doings. You have succumbed to the force of the water hole spirit, and now it can take you any time." Was it wrong to look at myself turning green? You abandoned yourself. You willed to abandon yourself. That was wrong. I have told you this already and I will repeat it again. You can survive in the world of a brujo only if you are a warrior. A warrior treats everything with respect and does not trample on anything unless he has to. You did not treat the water with respect yesterday. Usually you behave very well. However, yesterday you abandoned yourself to your death, like a goddamned fool. A warrior does not abandon himself to anything, not even to his death. A warrior is not a willing partner, a warrior is not available, and if he involves himself with something, you can be sure that he is aware of what he is doing. I did not know what to say. Don Juan was almost angry. That disturbed me. Don Juan had rarely behaved in such a way with me. I told him that I truly had no idea I was doing something wrong. After some minutes of tense silence, he took off his hat and smiled and told me that I had gained control over my indulging self. He stressed that I had to avoid water and keep it from touching the surface of my body for 3 or 4 months. "I don't think I could go without taking a shower," I said. Don Juan laughed until tears rolled down his cheeks. "You can't go without a shower. At times you're so weak I think you're putting me on. But it is not a joke. At times you really have no control and the forces of your life take you freely." I raised the point that it was humanly impossible to be controlled at all times. He maintained that for a warrior there was nothing out of control. I brought up the idea of accidents and said that what happened to me at the water canal could certainly be classed as an accident, since I neither meant it nor was I aware of my improper behavior. I talked about different people who had misfortunes that could be explained as accidents. I talked especially about Lucas, a very fine old Yaqui man who had suffered a serious injury when the truck he was driving overturned. It seems to me it is impossible to avoid accidents, I said. No man can control everything around him. True, Don Juan said cuttingly. But not everything is an unavoidable accident. Lucas doesn't live like a warrior. If he did, he'd know that he is waiting and what he is waiting for, and he wouldn't have driven that truck while he was drunk. He crashed against the rock side of the road because he was drunk and mangled his body for nothing. Life for a warrior is an exercise in strategy, Don Juan went on. But you want to find the meaning of life. A warrior doesn't care about meanings. If Lucas lived like a warrior and he had a chance to, as we all have a chance to, he would set his life strategically. Thus, if he couldn't avoid an accident that crushed his ribs, he would have found means to offset that handicap, or avoid its consequences, or battle against them. If Lucas were a warrior, he wouldn't be sitting in his dingy house dying of starvation. He would be battling to the end. I posed an alternative to Don Juan, using him as an example, and asked him what would be the outcome if he himself were to be involved in an accident that severed his legs. If I cannot help it and lose my legs, he said, I won't be able to be a man anymore. So I will join that which is waiting for me out there. He made a sweeping gesture with his hand to point all around him. I argued that he had misunderstood me. I had meant to point out that it was impossible for any single individual to foresee all the variables involved in his day-to-day actions. All I can say to you, Don Juan said, is that a warrior is never available. Never is he standing on the road waiting to be clobbered. Thus he cuts to a minimum his chances of the unforeseen. What you call accidents are, most of the time, very easy to avoid, except for fools who are living helter-skelter. It is not possible to live strategically all the time, I said. Imagine that someone is waiting for you with a powerful rifle with a telescopic sight. He could spot you accurately 500 yards away. What would you do? Don Juan looked at me with an air of disbelief and then broke into laughter. What would you do? I urged him. If someone is waiting for me with a rifle with a telescopic sight? He said, obviously mocking me. If someone is hiding out of sight, waiting for you, you won't have a chance. You can't stop a bullet. No, I can't. But I still don't understand your point. My point is that all your strategy cannot be of any help in a situation like that. Oh, but it can. If someone is waiting for me with a powerful rifle with a telescopic sight, I simply will not come around. My next attempt at seeing took place on September 3, 1969. Don Juan made me smoke 2 bowls of the mixture. The immediate effects were identical to those I had experienced during previous attempts. I remember that when my body was thoroughly numb, Don Juan held me by my right armpit and made me walk into the thick desert chaparral that grows for miles around his house. I cannot recollect what I or Don Juan did after we entered the brush, nor can I recall how long we walked. At a certain moment I found I was sitting on top of a small hill. Don Juan was sitting on my left side, touching me. I could not feel him, but I could see him with the corner of my eye. I had the feeling that he had been talking to me, although I could not remember his words. Yet I felt I knew exactly what he had said, in spite of the fact that I could not bring it back into my clear memory. I had the sensation that his words were like the cars of a train which was moving away, and his last word was like a square caboose. I knew what that last word was, but I could not say it or think clearly about it. It was a state of half-wakefulness with a dreamlike image of a train of words. Then very faintly I heard Don Juan's voice talking to me. "Now you must look at me," he said as he turned my head to face him. He repeated the statement 3 or 4 times. I looked and detected right away the same glowing effect I had perceived twice before while looking at his face. It was a mesmerizing movement, an undulatory shift of light within contained areas. There were no definite boundaries to those areas, and yet the waving light never spilled over, but moved within invisible limits. I scanned the glowing object in front of me, and immediately it started to lose its glow, and the familiar features of Don Juan's face emerged, or rather became superimposed on the fading glow. I must have then focused my gaze again. Don Juan's features faded and the glow intensified. I had placed my attention on an area which must have been his left eye. I noticed that there the movement of the glow was not contained. I detected something perhaps resembling explosions of sparks. The explosions were rhythmical and actually sent out something like particles of light that flew out with apparent force toward me, and then retreated as if they were rubber fibers. Don Juan must have turned my head around. Suddenly I found myself looking at a plowed field. "Now look ahead," I heard Don Juan saying. In front of me, perhaps 200 yards away, was a large, long hill. Its entire slope had been plowed. Horizontal furrows ran parallel to each other from the bottom to the very top of the hill. I noticed that in the plowed field there were quantities of small rocks and 3 huge boulders that interrupted the lineality of the furrows. There were some bushes right in front of me which prevented me from observing the details of a ravine or water canyon at the bottom of the hill. From where I was, the canyon appeared as a deep cut, with green vegetation markedly different from the barren hill. The greenness seemed to be trees that grew in the bottom of the canyon. I felt a breeze blowing in my eyes. I had a feeling of peace and profound quietness. There were no sounds of birds or insects. Don Juan spoke to me again. It took me a moment to understand what he was saying. "Do you see a man in that field?" he kept on asking. I wanted to tell him that there was no man in that field, but I could not vocalize the words. Don Juan took my head in his hands from behind. I could see his fingers over my eyebrows and on my cheeks, and made me pan over the field, moving my head slowly from right to left, and then in the opposite direction. "Watch every detail. Your life may depend on it," I heard him saying over and over. He made me pan 4 times over the 180-degree visual horizon in front of me. At one moment, when he had moved my head to face the extreme left, I thought I detected something moving in the field. I had a brief perception of movement with the corner of my right eye. He began to shift my head back to my right, and I was capable of focusing my gaze on the plowed field. I saw a man walking alongside the furrows. He was a plain man dressed like a Mexican peasant. He wore sandals, a pair of light gray pants, a long-sleeved beige shirt, and a straw hat, and carried a light brown bag with a strap over his right shoulder. Don Juan must have noticed that I had seen the man. He asked me repeatedly if the man was looking at me or if he was coming toward me. I wanted to tell him that the man was walking away and that his back was turned to me, but I could only say, "No." Don Juan said that if the man turned and came to me I should yell and he would turn my head away in order to protect me. I had no sense of fear or apprehension or involvement. I coldly watched the scene. The man stopped walking at the middle of the field. He stood with his right foot on a ledge of a large round boulder, as if he were tying his sandal. Then he straightened up, pulled a string from his bag, and wrapped it around his left hand. He turned his back to me and, facing the top of the hill, began scanning the area in front of him. I thought he was scanning because of the way he moved his head, which he kept turning slowly to his right. I saw him in profile, and then he began to turn his whole body toward me until he was looking at me. He actually jerked his head, or moved it in such a way that I knew beyond a doubt that he had seen me. He extended his left arm in front of him, pointing to the ground, and holding his arm in that position he began to walk toward me. "He's coming!" I yelled without any difficulty. Don Juan must have turned my head around, for next I was looking at the chaparral. He told me not to gaze, but look lightly at things and scan over them. He said that he was going to stand a short distance in front of me and then walk toward me, and that I should gaze at him until I saw his glow. I saw Don Juan moving to a spot perhaps 20 yards away. He walked with such incredible speed and agility that I could hardly believe it was Don Juan. He turned around and faced me and ordered me to gaze at him. His face was glowing. It looked like a blotch of light. The light seemed to spill over his chest almost to the middle of his body. It was as if I were looking at a light through my half-closed eyelids. The glow seemed to expand and recede. He must have begun to walk toward me because the light became more intense and more discernible. He said something to me. I struggled to understand and lost my view of the glow, and then I saw Don Juan as I see him in everyday life. He was a couple of feet away from me. He sat down facing me. As I pinpointed ray attention on his face, I began to perceive a vague glow. Then it was as if his face were crisscrossed by thin beams of light. Don Juan's face looked as if someone were shining tiny mirrors on it. As the light became more intense, the face lost its contours and was again an amorphous glowing object. I perceived once more the effect of pulsating explosions of light emanating from an area which must have been his left eye. I did not focus my attention on it, but deliberately gazed at an adjacent area which I surmised to be his right eye. I caught at once the sight of a clear, transparent pool of light. It was a liquid light. I noticed that perceiving was more than sighting, it was feeling. The pool of dark, liquid light had an extraordinary depth. It was friendly, kind. The light that emanated from it did not explode but whirled slowly inward, creating exquisite reflections. The glow had a very lovely and delicate way of touching me, of soothing me, which gave me a sensation of exquisiteness. I saw a symmetrical ring of brilliant dashes of light that expanded rhythmically on the vertical plane of the glowing area. The ring expanded to cover nearly all the glowing surface, and then contracted to a point of light in the middle of the brilliant pool. I saw the ring expanding and contracting several times. Then I deliberately moved back without losing my gaze, and was capable of seeing both eyes. I distinguished a rhythm of both types of light explosions. The left eye sent out dashes of light that actually protruded out of the vertical plane, while the right eye sent out dashes that radiated without protruding. The rhythm of the two eyes was alternating. The light of the left eye exploded outward, while the radiating light beams of the right eye contracted and whirled inward. Then the light of the right eye extended to cover the whole glowing surface, while the exploding light of the left eye receded. Don Juan must have turned me around once more, for I was again looking at the plowed field. I heard him telling me to watch the man. The man was standing by the boulder looking at me. I could not distinguish his features, his hat covered most of his face. After a moment he tucked his bag under his right arm and began to walk away toward my right. He walked almost to the end of the plowed area, changed direction, and took a few steps toward the gully. Then I lost control of my focusing and he vanished, and so did the total scenery. The image of the desert shrubs became superimposed on it. I do not recollect how I returned to Don Juan's house, nor do I remember what he did to me to bring me back. When I woke up I was lying on my straw mat in Don Juan's room. He came to my side and helped me up. I was dizzy, my stomach was upset. Don Juan in a very quick and efficient manner dragged me to the shrubs at the side of his house. I got sick and he laughed. Afterwards I felt better. I looked at my watch, it was 11 p.m. I went back to sleep, and by 1 o'clock the next afternoon I thought I was myself again. Don Juan kept asking me how I felt. I had the sensation of being absent-minded. I could not really concentrate. I walked around the house for a while under Don Juan's close scrutiny. He followed me around. I felt there was nothing to do and I went back to sleep. I woke up in the late afternoon feeling much better. I found a great many mashed leaves around me. In fact, when I woke up I was lying on my stomach on top of a pile of leaves. Their scent was very strong. I remember becoming aware of the scent before I fully woke up. I wandered to the back and found Don Juan sitting by the irrigation ditch. When he saw me approaching he made frantic gestures to make me stop and go back into the house. "Run inside!" he yelled. I ran into the house and he joined me a while later. "Don't ever come after me," he said. "If you want to see me, wait for me here." I apologized. He told me not to waste myself in silly apologies, which did not have the power to cancel my acts. He said that he had had a very difficult tune bringing me back, and that he had been interceding for me at the water. "We have to take a chance now and wash you in the water," he said. I assured him I felt fine. He gazed into my eyes for a long time. "Come with me," he said. "I'm going to put you in the water." "I'm fine," I said. "Look, I'm taking notes." He pulled me up from my mat with considerable force. "Don't indulge," he said. "In no time at all you will fall asleep again. Maybe I won't be able to wake you up this time." We ran to the back of his house. Before we reached the water he told me in a most dramatic tone to shut my eyes tight and not open them until he said to. He told me that if I gazed at the water even for an instant I might die. He led me by the hand and dunked me into the irrigation ditch head first. I kept my eyes shut as he went on submerging and pulling me out of the water for hours. The change I experienced was remarkable. Whatever was wrong with me before I entered the water was so subtle that I did not really notice it until I compared it with the feeling of well-being and alertness I had while Don Juan kept me in the irrigation canal. Water got into my nose and I began to sneeze. Don Juan pulled me out and led me, with my eyes still closed, into the house. He made me change my clothes and then guided me into his room, had me sit down on my mat, arranged the direction of my body, and then told me to open my eyes. I opened them and what I saw caused me to jump back and grab onto his leg. I experienced a tremendously confusing moment. Don Juan rapped me with his knuckles on the very top of my head. It was a quick blow which was not hard or painful, but somehow shocking. "What is the matter with you? What did you see?" he asked. Upon opening my eyes, I had seen the same scene I had watched before. I had seen the same man. This time, however, he was almost touching me. I saw his face. There was an air of familiarity about it. I almost knew who he was. The scene vanished when Don Juan hit me on the head. I looked up at Don Juan. He had his hand ready to hit me again. He laughed and asked if I would like to get another blow. I let go of his leg and relaxed on my mat. He ordered me to look straight ahead and not to turn around for any reason in the direction of the water at the back of his house. I then noticed for the first tune that it was pitch black in the room. For a moment I was not sure whether I had my eyes open. I touched them with my hands to make sure. I called Don Juan loudly and told him something was wrong with my eyes. I could not see at all, while a moment before I had seen him ready to hit me. I heard his laughter over my head to my right, and then he lit his kerosene lantern. My eyes adapted to the light in a matter of seconds. Everything was as it always had been. The wattle and daub walls of the room and the strangely contorted, dry medicinal roots hanging on them, the bundles of herbs, the thatched roof, the kerosene lantern hanging from a beam. I had seen the room hundreds of times, yet this time there was something unique about it and about myself. This was the first time I did not believe in the final reality of my perception. I had been edging toward that feeling, and I had perhaps intellectualized it at various times, but never had I been at the brink of a serious doubt. This time, however, I did not believe the room was real, and for a moment I had the strange sensation that it was a scene which would vanish if Don Juan rapped me on top of my head with his knuckles. I began to shiver without being cold. Nervous spasms ran down my spine. My head felt heavy, especially in the area right above my neck. I complained that I did not feel well and told him what I had seen. He laughed at me, saying that to succumb to fright was a miserable indulgence. "You're frightened without being afraid," he said. "You saw the ally staring at you, big deal. Wait until you have him face to face before you shit in your pants." He told me to get up and walk to my car without turning around in the direction of the water, and to wait for him while he got a rope and a shovel. He made me drive to a place where we had found a tree stump. We proceeded to dig it out in the darkness. I worked terribly hard for hours. We did not get the stump out, but I felt much better. We went back to his house and ate, and things were again perfectly real and commonplace. "What happened to me?" I asked. "What did I do yesterday?" "You smoked me and then you smoked an ally," he said. "I beg your pardon?" Don Juan laughed and said that next I was going to demand that he start telling me everything from the beginning. "You smoked me," he repeated. "You gazed into my face, into my eyes. You saw the lights that mark a man's face. I am a sorcerer, you saw that in my eyes. You did not know that, though, because this is the first time you've done it. The eyes of men are not all alike. You will soon find that out." "Then you smoked an ally. Do you mean the man in the field?" "That was not a man, that was an ally beckoning you." "Where did we go?" Where were we when I saw that man? I mean that ally. Don Juan made a gesture with his chin to point out an area in front of his house and said that he had taken me to the top of a small hill. I said that the scenery I had viewed had nothing to do with the desert chaparral around his house, and he replied that the ally that had beckoned me was not from the surroundings. Where is it from? I'll take you there very soon. What is the meaning of my vision? You were learning to see, that was all, but now you are about to lose your pants because you indulge, you have abandoned yourself to your fright. Maybe you should describe everything you saw. When I started to describe the way his own face had appeared to me, he made me stop and said that it was of no importance whatsoever. I told him that I had almost seen him as a luminous egg. He said that almost was not enough, and that seeing was going to take me a great deal of time and work. He was interested in the scene of the plowed field and in every detail I could remember about the man. That ally was beckoning you, he said. I made you move your head when he came to you not because he was endangering you, but because it is better to wait. You are not in a hurry. A warrior is never idle and never in a hurry. To meet an ally without being prepared is like attacking a lion with your farts. I like the metaphor. We had a delightful moment of laughter. What would have happened if you hadn't moved my head? You would have had to move your head yourself. And if I didn't? The ally would have come to you and scared you stiff. If you had been alone, he might have killed you. It is not advisable for you to be alone in the mountains or the desert until you can defend yourself. An ally might catch you alone there and make mincemeat out of you. What was the meaning of the acts he performed? By looking at you, he meant he welcomes you. He showed you that you need a spirit catcher and a pouch, but not from this area. His bag was from another part of the country. You have 3 stumbling blocks in your way that make you stop. Those were the boulders. And you definitely are going to get your best powers in water canyons and gullies. The ally pointed out the gully to you. The rest of the scene was meant to help you locate the exact place to find him. I know now where the place is. I will take you there very soon. Do you mean that the scenery I saw really exists? Of course. Where? I cannot tell you that. How would I find that area? I cannot tell you that either, and not because I don't want to, but because I simply don't know how to tell you. I wanted to know the meaning of seeing the same scene while I was in his room. Don Juan laughed and imitated me holding onto his leg. That was a reaffirmation that the ally wants you, he said. He made sure you were. I knew that he was welcoming you. What about the face I saw? It is a familiar face to you because you know him. You have seen it before. Maybe it is the face of your death. You got frightened, but that was your carelessness. He was waiting for you, and when he showed up you succumbed to fright. Fortunately, I was there to hit you or he would have turned against you, which would have been only proper. To meet an ally, a man must be a spotless warrior or the ally may turn against him and destroy him. Don Juan dissuaded me from going back to Los Angeles the next morning. Apparently he thought I still had not totally recovered. He insisted that I sit inside his room facing the southeast in order to preserve my strength. He sat to my left, handed me my notebook, and said that this time I had him pinned down. He not only had to stay with me, he also had to talk to me. I have to take you to the water again in the twilight, he said. You're not solid yet and you shouldn't be alone today. I'll keep you company all morning. In the afternoon you'll be in better shape. His concern made me feel very apprehensive. "What's wrong with me?" I asked. "You've tapped an ally." "What do you mean by that?" "We must not talk about allies today. Let us talk about anything else." I really did not want to talk at all. I had begun to feel anxious and restless. Don Juan apparently found the situation utterly ludicrous. He laughed till the tears came. "Don't tell me that at a time when you should talk you are not going to find anything to say," he said, his eyes shining with a mischievous glint. His mood was very soothing to me. There was only one topic that interested me at that moment. The ally. His face was so familiar, it was not as if I knew him, more as if I had seen him before. It was something else. Every time I began to think about his face, my mind experienced a bombardment of other thoughts, as if some part of myself knew the secret, but did not allow the rest of me to come close to it. The sensation of the ally's face being familiar was so eerie that it had forced me into a state of morbid melancholy. Don Juan had said that it might have been the face of my death. I think that statement had clinched me. I wanted desperately to ask about it, and I had the clear sensation that Don Juan was holding me back. I took a couple of deep breaths and blurted out a question. "What is death, Don Juan?" "I don't know," he said, smiling. "I mean, how would you describe death? I want your opinions. I think everybody has definite opinions about death. I don't know what you're talking about." I had the Tibetan Book of the Dead in the trunk of my car. It occurred to me to use it as a topic of conversation, since it dealt with death. I said I was going to read it to him and began to get up. He made me sit down and went out and got the book himself. "The morning is a bad time for sorcerers," he said as an explanation for my having to stay put. "You're too weak to leave my room. Inside here you are protected. If you were to wander off now, chances are that you would find a terrible disaster. An ally could kill you on the road or in the bush, and later on when they found your body they would say that you had either died mysteriously or had an accident." I was in no position or mood to question his decisions, so I stayed put nearly all morning reading and explaining some parts of the book to him. He listened attentively and did not interrupt me at all. Twice I had to stop for short periods of time while he brought some water and food, but as soon as he was free again, he urged me to continue reading. He seemed to be very interested. When I finished, he looked at me. "I don't understand why those people talk about death as if death were like life," he said softly. "Maybe that's the way they understand it. Do you think the Tibetans see?" "Hardly. When a man learns to see, not a single thing he knows prevails. Not a single one. If the Tibetans could see, they could tell right away that not a single thing is any longer the same. Once we see, nothing is known, nothing remains as we used to know it when we didn't see. Perhaps, Don Juan, seeing is not the same for everyone." True. It's not the same. Still, that does not mean that the meanings of life prevail. When one learns to see, not a single thing is the same. Tibetans obviously think that death is like life. "What do you think death is like, yourself?" I asked. "I don't think death is like anything, and I think the Tibetans must be talking about something else. At any rate, what they're talking about is not death." "What do you think they're talking about? Maybe you can tell me that. You're the one who reads." I tried to say something else, but he began to laugh. "Perhaps the Tibetans really see," Don Juan went on, In which case they must have realized that what they see makes no sense at all, and they wrote that bunch of crap because it doesn't make any difference to them, in which case what they wrote is not crap at all. I really don't care about what the Tibetans have to say, I said, but I certainly care about what you have to say. I would like to hear what you think about death. He stared at me for an instant and then giggled. He opened his eyes and raised his eyebrows in a comical gesture of surprise. Death is a whorl, he said. Death is the face of the ally. Death is a shiny cloud over the horizon. Death is the whisper of Mescalito in your ears. Death is the toothless mouth of the guardian. Death is Genero sitting on his head. Death is me talking. Death is you and your writing pad. Death is nothing. Nothing. It is here yet it isn't here at all. Don Juan laughed with great delight. His laughter was like a song. It had a sort of dancing rhythm. I make no sense, huh? Don Juan said. I cannot tell you what death is like. But perhaps I could tell you about your own death. There is no way of knowing what it will be like for sure, however, I could tell you what it may be like. I became frightened at that point and argued that I only wanted to know what death appeared to be like to him. I emphasized that I was interested in his opinions about death in a general sense, but did not care to know about the particulars of anybody's personal death, especially my own. I can't talk about death except in personal terms, he said. You wanted me to tell you about death. All right. Then don't be afraid of hearing about your own death. I admitted that I was too nervous to talk about it. I said that I wanted to talk about death in general terms, as he himself had done when he told me that at the time of his son Eulalio's death, life and death mixed like a fog of crystals. I told you that my son's life expanded at the time of his personal death, he said. I was not talking about death in general but about my son's death. Death, whatever it is, made his life expand. I definitely wanted to steer the conversation out of the realm of particulars and mentioned that I had been reading accounts of people who had died for several minutes and had been revived through medical techniques. In all the cases I had read, the persons involved had made statements, upon reviving, that they could not recollect anything at all, that dying was simply a sensation of blacking out. That's perfectly understandable, he said. Death has two stages. The first is a blackout. It is a meaningless stage, very similar to the first effect of Mescalito, in which one experiences a lightness that makes one feel happy, complete, and that everything in the world is at ease. But that is only a shallow state. It soon vanishes and one enters a new realm, a realm of harshness and power. That second stage is the real encounter with Mescalito. Death is very much like this. The first stage is a shallow blackout. The second, however, is the real stage where one meets with death. It is a brief moment after the first blackout when we find that we are, somehow, ourselves again. It is then that death smashes against us with quiet fury and power until it dissolves our lives into nothing. How can you be sure that you are talking about death? I have my ally. The little smoke has shown me my unmistakable death with great clarity. This is why I can only talk about personal death. Don Juan's words caused me a profound apprehension and a dramatic ambivalence. I had a feeling he was going to describe the overt, commonplace details of my death and tell me how or when I was going to die. The mere thought of knowing that made me despair and at the same time provoked my curiosity. I could have asked him to describe his own death, of course, but I felt that such a request would be rather rude, and I ruled it out automatically. Don Juan seemed to be enjoying my conflict. His body convulsed with laughter. "Do you want to know what your death may be like?" he asked me with childlike delight in his face. I found his mischievous pleasure in teasing me rather comforting. It almost took the edge off my apprehension. "Okay, tell me," I said, and my voice cracked. He had a formidable explosion of laughter. He held his stomach and rolled on his side, and mockingly repeated, "Okay, tell me," with a crack in his voice. Then he straightened out and sat down, assuming a feigned stiffness, and in a tremulous voice he said, "The second stage of your death may very well be as follows." His eyes examined me with apparently genuine curiosity. I laughed. I clearly realized that his making fun was the only device that could dull the edge of the idea of one's death. "You drive a great deal," he went on saying, "so you may find yourself, at a given moment, behind the wheel again. It will be a very fast sensation that won't give you time to think. Suddenly, let's say, you would find yourself driving, as you have done thousands of times. But before you could wonder about yourself, you would notice a strange formation in front of your windshield. If you looked closer, you'd realize that it is a cloud that looks like a shiny whorl. It would resemble, let's say, a face right in the middle of the sky in front of you. As you watched it, you would see it moving backward until it was only a brilliant point in the distance, and then you would notice that it began moving toward you again. It would pick up speed, and in a blink of an eye, it would smash against the windshield of your car. You are strong. I'm sure it would take death a couple of whams to get you. By then you would know where you were and what was happening to you. The face would recede again to a position on the horizon, would pick up speed and smash against you. The face would enter inside you, and then you'd know it was the Allies' face all the time, or it was me talking, or you writing. Death was nothing all the time. Nothing. It was a little dot lost in the sheets of your notebook. And yet it would enter inside you with uncontrollable force and would make you expand. It would make you flat and extend you over the sky and the earth and beyond. And you would be like a fog of tiny crystals moving away. I was very taken by his description of my death. I had expected to hear something so different. I could not say anything for a long time. "Death enters through the belly," he continued. "Right through the gap of the will. That area is the most important and sensitive part of man. It is the area of the will and also the area through which all of us die. I know it because my ally has guided me to that stage. A sorcerer tunes his will by letting his death overtake him, and when he is fiat and begins to expand, his impeccable will takes over and assembles the fog into one person again." Don Juan made a strange gesture. He opened his hands like two fans, lifted them to the level of his elbows, turned them until his thumbs were touching his sides, and then brought them slowly together at the center of his body over his navel. He kept them there for a moment. His arms shivered with the strain. Then he brought them up until the tips of his middle fingers touched his forehead, and then pulled them down in the same position to the center of his body. It was a formidable gesture. Don Juan had performed it with such force and beauty that I was spellbound. "It is his will which assembles a sorcerer," he said, "but as his old age makes him feeble, his will wanes, and a moment unavoidably comes when he is no longer capable of commanding his will." He then has nothing with which to oppose the silent force of his death, and his life becomes like the lives of all his fellow men, an expanding fog moving beyond its limits. Don Juan stared at me and stood up. I was shivering. "You can go to the bushes now," he said. "It is afternoon." I needed to go, but I did not dare. I felt perhaps more jumpy than afraid. However, I was no longer apprehensive about the ally. Don Juan said that it did not matter how I felt as long as I was solid. He assured me I was in perfect shape and could safely go into the bushes as long as I did not get close to the water. "That is another matter," he said. "I need to wash you once more, so stay away from the water." Later on, he wanted me to drive him to the nearby town. I mentioned that driving would be a welcome change for me because I was still shaky. The idea that a sorcerer actually played with his death was quite gruesome to me. "To be a sorcerer is a terrible burden," he said in a reassuring tone. "I've told you that it is much better to learn to see. A man who sees is everything. In comparison, the sorcerer is a sad fellow." "What is sorcery, Don Juan?" He looked at me for a long time as he shook his head almost imperceptibly. "Sorcery is to apply one's will to a key joint," he said. "Sorcery is interference. A sorcerer searches and finds the key joint of anything he wants to affect, and then he applies his will to it. A sorcerer doesn't have to see to be a sorcerer, all he has to know is how to use his will." I asked him to explain what he meant by a key joint. He thought for a while, and then he said that he knew what my car was. "It's obviously a machine," I said. "I mean, your car is the spark plugs. That's its key joint for me. I can apply my will to it, and your car won't work." Don Juan got into my car and sat down. He beckoned me to do likewise as he made himself comfortable on the seat. "Watch what I do," he said. "I'm a crow, so first I'll make my feathers loose." He shivered his entire body. His movement reminded me of a sparrow wetting its feathers in a puddle. He lowered his head like a bird dipping its beak into the water. "That feels really good," he said, and began to laugh. His laughter was strange. It had a very peculiar mesmerizing effect on me. I recollected having heard him laugh in that manner many times before. Perhaps the reason I had never become overtly aware of it was that he had never laughed like that long enough in my presence. "A crow loosens its neck next," he said, and began twisting his neck and rubbing his cheeks on his shoulders. "Then he looks at the world with one eye and then with the other." His head shook as he allegedly shifted his view of the world from one eye to the other. The pitch of his laughter became higher. I had the absurd feeling that he was going to turn into a crow in front of my eyes. I wanted to laugh it off, but I was almost paralyzed. I actually felt some kind of enveloping force around me. I was not afraid, nor was I dizzy or sleepy. My faculties were unimpaired, to the best of my judgment. "Turn on your car now," Don Juan said. I turned on the starter and automatically stepped on the gas pedal. The starter began to grind without igniting the engine. Don Juan's laughter was a soft, rhythmical cackle. I tried it again and again. I spent perhaps 10 minutes grinding the starter of my car. Don Juan cackled all that time. Then I gave up and sat there with a heavy head. He stopped laughing and scrutinized me, and I knew then that his laughter had forced me into a sort of hypnotic trance. Although I had been thoroughly aware of what was taking place, I felt I was not myself. During the time I could not start my car, I was very docile, almost numb. It was as if Don Juan was not only doing something to my car, but also to me. When he stopped cackling, I was convinced the spell was over, and impetuously I turned on the starter again. I had the certainty Don Juan had only mesmerized me with his laughter and made me believe I could not start my car. With the corner of my eye, I saw him looking curiously at me as I ground the motor and pumped the gas furiously. Don Juan patted me gently and said that fury would make me solid, and perhaps I would not need to be washed in the water again. The more furious I could get, the quicker I could recover from my encounter with the ally. "Don't be embarrassed," I heard Don Juan saying. "Kick the car." His natural everyday laughter exploded, and I felt ridiculous and laughed sheepishly. After a while, Don Juan said he had released the car. It started. September 28, 1969. There was something eerie about Don Juan's house. For a moment I thought he was hiding somewhere around the place to scare me. I called out to him and then gathered enough nerve to walk inside. Don Juan was not there. I put the 2 bags of groceries I had brought on a pile of firewood and sat down to wait for him, as I had done dozens of times before. But for the first time in my years of associating with Don Juan, I was afraid to stay alone in his house. I felt a presence, as if someone invisible was there with me. I remembered then that years before I had had the same vague feeling that something unknown was prowling around me when I was alone. I jumped to my feet and ran out of the house. I had come to see Don Juan to tell him that the cumulative effect of the task of seeing was taking its toll on me. I had begun to feel uneasy, vaguely apprehensive without any overt reason, tired without being fatigued. Then my reaction at being alone in Don Juan's house brought back the total memory of how my fear had built up in the past. The fear traced back to years before, when Don Juan had forced the very strange confrontation between a sorceress, a woman he called La Catalina, and me. It began on November 23, 1961. When I found him in his house with a dislocated ankle. He explained that he had an enemy, a sorceress who could turn into a blackbird, and who had attempted to kill him. "As soon as I can walk, I'm going to show you who the woman is," Don Juan said. "You must know who she is. Why does she want to kill you?" He shrugged his shoulders impatiently and refused to say anything else. I came back to see him 10 days later and found him perfectly well. He rotated his ankle to demonstrate to me that it was fine, and attributed his prompt recovery to the nature of the cast he himself had made. "It's good you're here," he said. "Today I'm going to take you on a little journey." He then directed me to drive to a desolate area. We stopped there. Don Juan stretched his legs and made himself comfortable on the seat, as if he were going to take a nap. He told me to relax and remain very quiet. He said we had to be as inconspicuous as possible until nightfall, because the late afternoon was a very dangerous time for the business we were pursuing. "What kind of business are we pursuing?" I asked. "We are here to stake out La Catalina," he said. When it was fairly dark, we slid out of the car and walked very slowly and noiselessly into the desert chaparral. From the place where we stopped, I could distinguish the black silhouette of the hills on both sides. We were in a flat, fairly wide canyon. Don Juan gave me detailed instructions on how to stay merged with the chaparral, and taught me a way to sit in vigil, as he called it. He told me to tuck my right leg under my left thigh and keep my left leg in a squat position. He explained that the tucked leg was used as a spring in order to stand up with great speed, if it were necessary. He then told me to sit facing the west, because that was the direction of the woman's house. He sat next to me, to my right, and told me in a whisper to keep my eyes focused on the ground, searching, or rather, waiting, for a sort of wind wave that would make a ripple in the bushes. Whenever the ripple touched the bushes on which I had focused my gaze, I was supposed to look up and see the sorceress in all her magnificent evil splendor. Don Juan actually used those words. When I asked him to explain what he meant, he said that if I detected a ripple, I simply had to look up and see for myself, because a sorcerer in flight was such a unique sight that it defied explanations. There was a fairly steady wind and I thought I detected a ripple in the bushes many times. I looked up each time, prepared to have a transcendental experience, but I did not see anything. Every time the wind blew the bushes, Don Juan would kick the ground vigorously, whirling around, moving his arms as if they were whips. The strength of his movements was extraordinary. After a few failures to see the sorceress in flight, I was sure I was not going to witness any transcendental event, yet Don Juan's display of power was so exquisite that I did not mind spending the night there. At daybreak, Don Juan sat down by me. He seemed to be totally exhausted. He could hardly move. He lay down on his back and mumbled that he had failed to pierce the woman. I was very intrigued by that statement. He repeated it several times, and each time his tone became more downhearted, more desperate. I began to experience an unusual anxiety. I found it very easy to project my feelings into Don Juan's mood. Don Juan did not mention anything about the incident or the woman for several months. I thought he had either forgotten or resolved the whole affair. One day, however, I found him in a very agitated mood, and in a manner that was completely incongruous with his natural calmness. He told me that the blackbird had stood in front of him the night before, almost touching him, and that he had not even awakened. The woman's artfulness was so great that he had not felt her presence at all. He said his good fortune was to wake up in the nick of time to stage a horrendous fight for his life. Don Juan's tone of voice was moving, almost pathetic. I felt an overwhelming surge of compassion and concern. In a somber and dramatic tone, he reaffirmed that he had no way to stop her, and that the next time she came near him was going to be his last day on earth. I became despondent and was nearly in tears. Don Juan seemed to notice my profound concern and laughed, I thought, bravely. He patted me on the back and said that I should not worry, that he was not altogether lost yet, because he had one last card, a trump card. A warrior lives strategically, he said, smiling. A warrior never carries loads he cannot handle. Don Juan's smile had the power to dispel the ominous clouds of doom. I suddenly felt elated and we both laughed. He patted my head. You know, of all the things on this earth, you are my last card, he said abruptly, looking straight into my eyes. What? You are my trump card in my fight against that witch. I did not understand what he meant, and he explained that the woman did not know me, and that if I played my hand as he would direct me, I had a better than good chance to pierce her. What do you mean by pierce her? You cannot kill her, but you must pierce her like a balloon. If you do that, she'll leave me alone. But don't think about it now. I'll tell you what to do when the time comes. Months went by. I had forgotten the incident and was caught by surprise when I arrived at his house one day. Don Juan came out running and did not let me get out of my car. "You must leave immediately," he whispered with appalling urgency. "Listen carefully. Buy a shotgun, or get one in any way you can. Don't bring me your own gun, do you understand? Get any gun, except your own, and bring it here right away. Why do you want a shotgun? Go now." I returned with a shotgun. I had not had enough money to buy one, but a friend of mine had given me his old gun. Don Juan did not look at it. He explained, laughing, that he had been abrupt with me because the blackbird was on the roof of the house, and he did not want her to see me. Finding the blackbird on the roof gave me the idea that you could bring a gun and pierce her with it, Don Juan said emphatically. "I don't want anything to happen to you, so I suggested that you buy the gun or that you get one in any other way. You see, you have to destroy the gun after completing the task." "What kind of task are you talking about?" "You must attempt to pierce the woman with your shotgun." He made me clean the gun by rubbing it with the fresh leaves and stems of a peculiarly scented plant. He himself rubbed 2 shells and placed them inside the barrels. Then he said I was to hide in front of his house and wait until the blackbird landed on the roof, and then, after taking careful aim, I was supposed to let go with both barrels. The effect of the surprise, more than the pellets, would pierce the woman, and if I were powerful and determined I could force her to leave him alone. Thus my aim had to be impeccable, and so did my determination to pierce her. "You must scream at the moment you shoot," he said. "It must be a potent and piercing yell." He then piled bundles of bamboo and fire sticks about 10 feet away from the ramada of his house. He made me lean against the piles. The position was quite comfortable. I was sort of half-seated, my back was well propped, and I had a good view of the roof. He said it was too early for the witch to be out, and that we had until dusk to do all the preparations. He would then pretend he was locking himself inside the house in order to attract her and elicit another attack on his person. He told me to relax and find a comfortable position that I could shoot from without moving. He made me aim at the roof a couple of times and concluded that the act of lifting the gun to my shoulder and taking aim was too slow and cumbersome. He then built a prop for the gun. He made 2 deep holes with a pointed iron bar, planted 2 forked sticks in them, and tied a long pole in between the forks. The structure gave me a shooting support and allowed me to keep the gun aimed at the roof. Don Juan looked at the sky and said it was time for him to go into the house. He got up and calmly went inside, giving me the final admonition that my endeavor was not a joke and that I had to hit the bird with the first shot. After Don Juan left, I had a few more minutes of twilight, and then it became quite dark. It seemed as if darkness had been waiting until I was alone, and suddenly it descended on me. I tried to focus my eyes on the roof, which was silhouetted against the sky. For a while there was enough light on the horizon, so the line of the roof was still visible, but then the sky became black, and I could hardly see the house. I kept my eyes focused on the roof for hours without noticing anything at all. I saw a couple of owls flying by toward the north. The span of their wings was quite remarkable, and they could not be mistaken for blackbirds. At a given moment, however, I distinctly noticed the black shape of a small bird landing on the roof. It was definitely a bird. My heart began pounding hard. I felt a buzzing in my ears. I aimed in the dark and pulled both triggers. There was quite a loud explosion. I felt a strong recoil of the gun butt on my shoulder, and at the same time I heard a most piercing and horrendous human shriek. It was loud and eerie and seemed to have come from the roof. I had a moment of total confusion. I then remembered that Don Juan had admonished me to yell as I shot, and I had forgotten to do so. I was thinking of reloading my gun when Don Juan opened the door and came out running. He had his kerosene lantern with him. He appeared to be quite nervous. "I think you got her," he said. "We must find the dead bird now." He brought a ladder and made me climb up and look on the ramada, but I could not find anything there. He climbed up and looked himself for a while, with equally negative results. "Perhaps you have blasted the bird to bits," Don Juan said, "in which case we must find at least a feather." We began looking around the ramada first and then around the house. We looked with the light of the lantern until morning. Then we started looking again all over the area we had covered during the night. Around 11 a.m. Don Juan called off our search. He sat down dejected, smiled sheepishly at me, and said that I had failed to stop his enemy, and that now, more than ever before, his life was not worth a hoot, because the woman was doubtlessly irked, itching to take revenge. "You're safe, though," Don Juan said reassuringly. "The woman doesn't know you." As I was walking to my car to return home, I asked him if I had to destroy the shotgun. He said the gun had done nothing, and I should give it back to its owner. I noticed a profound look of despair in Don Juan's eyes. I felt so moved by it that I was about to weep. "What can I do to help you?" I asked. "There's nothing you can do," Don Juan said. We remained silent for a moment. I wanted to leave right away. I felt an oppressive anguish. I was ill at ease. "Would you really try to help me?" Don Juan asked in a childlike tone. I told him again that my total person was at his disposal, that my affection for him was so profound I would undertake any kind of action to help him. Don Juan smiled and asked again if I really meant that, and I vehemently reaffirmed my desire to help him. "If you really mean it," he said, "I may have one more chance." He seemed to be delighted. He smiled broadly and clapped his hands several times, the way he always does when he wants to express a feeling of pleasure. This change of mood was so remarkable that it also involved me. I suddenly felt that the oppressive mood, the anguish, had been vanquished, and life was inexplicably exciting again. Don Juan sat down and I did likewise. He looked at me for a long moment and then proceeded to tell me in a very calm and deliberate manner that I was in fact the only person who could help him at that moment, and thus he was going to ask me to do something very dangerous and very special. He paused for a moment as if he wanted a reaffirmation on my part, and I again reiterated my firm desire to do anything for him. "I'm going to give you a weapon to pierce her," he said. He took a long object from his pouch and handed it to me. I took it and then examined it. I almost dropped it. "It is a wild boar," he went on. "You must pierce her with it." The object I was holding was a dry foreleg of a wild boar. The skin was ugly, and the bristles were revolting to the touch. The hoof was intact, and its two halves were spread out, as if the leg were stretched. It was an awful-looking thing. It made me feel almost sick to my stomach. He quickly took it back. "You must ram the wild boar right into her navel," Don Juan said. "What?" I said in a feeble voice. You must hold the wild boar in your left hand and stab her with it. She is a sorceress and the wild boar will enter her belly, and no one in this world, except another sorcerer, will see it stuck in there. This is not an ordinary battle but an affair of sorcerers. The danger you will run is that if you fail to pierce her, she might strike you dead on the spot, or her companions and relatives will shoot you or knife you. You may, on the other hand, get out without a scratch. If you succeed, she will have a hellish time with the wild boar in her body, and she will leave me alone. An oppressive anguish enveloped me again. I had a profound affection for Don Juan. I admired him. At the time of this startling request, I had already learned to regard his way of life and his knowledge as a paramount accomplishment. How could anyone let a man like that die? And yet how could anyone deliberately risk his life? I became so immersed in my deliberations I did not notice that Don Juan had stood up and was standing by me until he patted me on the shoulder. I looked up. He was smiling benevolently. Whenever you feel that you really want to help me, you should return, he said, but not until then. If you come back, I know what we will have to do. Go now. If you don't want to return, I'll understand that too. I automatically stood up, got into my car, and drove away. Don Juan had actually let me off the hook. I could have left and never returned, but somehow the thought of being free to leave did not soothe me. I drove a while longer and then impulsively turned around and drove back to Don Juan's house. He was still sitting underneath his ramada and did not seem surprised to see me. Sit down, he said. The clouds in the west are beautiful. It will be dark shortly. Sit quietly and let the twilight fill you. Do whatever you want now, but when I tell you, look straight at those shiny clouds and ask the twilight to give you power and calmness. I sat facing the western clouds for a couple of hours. Don Juan went into the house and stayed inside. When it was getting dark, he returned. The twilight has come, he said. Stand up. Don't close your eyes, but look straight at the clouds. Put your arms up with your hands open and your fingers extended and trot in place. I followed his instructions. I lifted my arms over my head and began trotting. Don Juan came to my side and corrected my movements. He placed the leg of the wild boar against a palm of my left hand and made me hold it with my thumb. He then pulled my arms down until they pointed to the orange and dark gray clouds over the horizon, toward the west. He extended my fingers like fans and told me not to curl them over the palms of my hands. It was of crucial importance that I keep my fingers spread because if I closed them, I would not be asking the twilight for power and calm, but would be menacing it. He also corrected my trotting. He said it should be peaceful and uniform, as if I were actually running toward the twilight with my extended arms. I could not fall asleep during that night. It was as if, instead of calming me, the twilight had agitated me into a frenzy. I still have so many things pending in my life, I said. So many things unresolved. Don Juan chuckled softly. Nothing is pending in the world, he said. Nothing is finished, yet nothing is unresolved. Go to sleep. Don Juan's words were strangely soothing. Around 10 o'clock the next morning, Don Juan gave me something to eat, and then we were on our way. He whispered that we were going to approach the woman around noon, or before noon if possible. He said that the ideal time would have been the early hours of the day, because a witch is always less powerful or less aware in the morning, but she would never leave the protection of her house at those hours. I did not ask any questions. He directed me to the highway, and at a certain point he told me to stop and park on the side of the road. He said we had to wait there. I looked at my watch. It was 5 minutes to 11. I yawned repeatedly. I was actually sleepy. My mind wandered around aimlessly. Suddenly Don Juan straightened up and nudged me. I jumped up in my seat. "There she is," he said. I saw a woman walking toward the highway on the edge of a cultivated field. She was carrying a basket looped in her right arm. It was not until then that I noticed we were parked near a crossroads. There were two narrow trails which ran parallel to both sides of the highway, and another wider and more trafficked trail that ran perpendicular to the highway. Obviously, people who used that trail had to walk across the paved road. When the woman was still on the dirt road, Don Juan told me to get out of the car. "Do it now," he said firmly. I obeyed him. The woman was almost on the highway. I ran and overtook her. I was so close to her that I felt her clothes on my face. I took the wild boar hoof from under my shirt and thrust it at her. I did not feel any resistance to the blunt object I had in my hand. I saw a fleeting shadow in front of me, like a drape. My head turned to my right, and I saw the woman standing 50 feet away on the opposite side of the road. She was a fairly young, dark woman with a strong, stocky body. She was smiling at me. Her teeth were white and big, and her smile was placid. She had closed her eyes halfway, as if to protect them from the wind. She was still holding her basket, looped over her right arm. I then had a moment of unique confusion. I turned around to look at Don Juan. He was making frantic gestures to call me back. I ran back. There were 3 or 4 men coming in a hurry toward me. I got into the car and sped away in the opposite direction. I tried to ask Don Juan what had happened, but I could not talk. My ears were bursting with an overwhelming pressure. I felt that I was choking. He seemed to be pleased and began to laugh. It was as if my failure did not concern him. I had my hands so tight around the steering wheel that I could not move them. They were frozen. My arms were rigid, and so were my legs. In fact, I could not take my foot off the gas pedal. Don Juan patted me on the back and told me to relax. Little by little the pressure in my ears diminished. "What happened back there?" I finally asked. He giggled like a child without answering. Then he asked me if I had noticed the way the woman got out of the way. He praised her excellent speed. Don Juan's talk seemed so incongruous that I could not really follow him. He praised the woman. He said her power was impeccable and she was a relentless enemy. I asked Don Juan if he did not mind my failure. I was truly surprised and annoyed at his change of mood. He seemed to be actually glad. He told me to stop. I parked alongside the road. He put his hand on my shoulder and looked piercingly into my eyes. "Whatever I have done to you today was a trick," he said bluntly. "The rule is that a man of knowledge has to trap his apprentice. Today I have trapped you and I have tricked you into learning." I was dumbfounded. I could not arrange my thoughts. Don Juan explained that the whole involvement with the woman was a trap, that she had never been a threat to him, and that his job was to put me in touch with her under specific conditions of abandon and power I had experienced when I tried to pierce her. He commended my resolution and called it an act of power which demonstrated to the woman that I was capable of great exertion. Don Juan said that even though I was not aware of it, all I did was to show off in front of her. You could never touch her, he said, but you showed your claws to her. She knows now that you're not afraid. You have challenged her. I used her to trick you because she's powerful and relentless and never forgets. Men are usually too busy to be relentless enemies. I felt a terrible anger. I told him that one should not play with a person's innermost feelings and loyalties. Don Juan laughed until tears rolled down his cheeks, and I hated him. I had an overwhelming desire to punch him and leave. There was, however, such a strange rhythm in his laughter that it kept me almost paralyzed. "Don't be so angry," Don Juan said soothingly. Then he said that his acts had never been a farce, that he also had thrown his life away a long time before, when his own benefactor tricked him, just as he had tricked me. Don Juan said that his benefactor was a cruel man who did not think about him the way he, Don Juan, thought about me. He added very sternly that the woman had tested her strength against him and had really tried to kill him. Now she knows that I was playing with her, he said, laughing, and she'll hate you for it. She can't do anything to me, but she will take it out on you. She doesn't know yet how much power you have, so she will come to test you, little by little. Now you have no choice but to learn in order to defend yourself, or you will fall prey to that lady. She is no trick. Don Juan reminded me of the way she had flown away. Don't be angry, he said. It was not an ordinary trick. It was the rule. There was something about the way the woman moved away from me that was truly maddening. I had witnessed it myself. She had jumped the width of the highway in a flick of an eyelash. I had no way to get out of that certainty. From that moment on, I focused all my attention on that incident, and little by little I accumulated proof that she was actually following me. The final outcome was that I had to withdraw from the apprenticeship under the pressure of my irrational fear. I came back to Don Juan's house hours later, in the early afternoon. He was apparently waiting for me. He came up to me as I got out of my car and examined me with curious eyes, walking around me a couple of times. "Why the nervousness?" he asked before I had time to say anything. I explained that something had scared me off that morning and that I had begun to feel something prowling around me, as in the past. Don Juan sat down and seemed to be engulfed in thoughts. His face had an unusually serious expression. He seemed to be tired. I sat by him and arranged my notes. After a very long pause, his face brightened up and he smiled. "What you felt this morning was the spirit of the water hole," he said. "I've told you that you must be prepared for unexpected encounters with those forces. I thought you understood." I did. "Then why the fear?" I could not answer. "That spirit is on your trail," he said. "That already tapped you in the water. I assure you it will tap you again, and probably you won't be prepared, and that encounter will be your end." Don Juan's words made me feel genuinely concerned. My feelings were strange, however. I was concerned but not afraid. Whatever was happening to me had not been able to elicit my old feelings of blind fear. "What should I do?" I asked. "You forget too easily," he said. "The path of knowledge is a forced one. In order to learn, we must be spurred. In the path of knowledge, we are always fighting something, avoiding something, prepared for something, and that something is always inexplicable, greater, more powerful than us. The inexplicable forces will come to you. Now it is the spirit of the water hole, later on it'll be your own ally, so there is nothing you can do now but to prepare yourself for the struggle. Years ago La Catalina spurred you. She was only a sorceress, though, and that was a beginner's trick. The world is indeed full of frightening things, and we are helpless creatures surrounded by forces that are inexplicable and unbending. The average man, in ignorance, believes that those forces can be explained or changed. He doesn't really know how to do that, but he expects that the actions of mankind will explain them or change them sooner or later. The sorcerer, on the other hand, does not think of explaining or changing them. Instead, he learns to use such forces by redirecting himself and adapting to their direction. That's his trick. There is very little to sorcery once you find out its trick. A sorcerer is only slightly better off than the average man. Sorcery does not help him to live a better life. In fact, I should say that sorcery hinders him. It makes his life cumbersome, precarious. By opening himself to knowledge, a sorcerer becomes more vulnerable than the average man. On the one hand, his fellow men hate him and fear him, and will strive to end his life. On the other hand, the inexplicable and unbending forces that surround every one of us, by right of our being alive, are for a sorcerer a source of even greater danger. To be pierced by a fellow man is indeed painful, but nothing in comparison to being touched by an ally. A sorcerer, by opening himself to knowledge, falls prey to such forces, and has only one means of balancing himself, his will. Thus he must feel and act like a warrior. I will repeat this once more. Only as a warrior can one survive the path of knowledge. What helps a sorcerer live a better life is the strength of being a warrior. It is my commitment to teach you to see. Not because I personally want to do so, but because you were chosen, you were pointed out to me by Mescalito. I am compelled by my personal desire, however, to teach you to feel and act like a warrior. I personally believe that to be a warrior is more suitable than anything else. Therefore, I have endeavored to show you those forces as a sorcerer perceives them, because only under their terrifying impact can one become a warrior. To see without first being a warrior would make you weak. It would give you a false meekness, a desire to retreat. Your body would decay because you would become indifferent. It is my personal commitment to make you a warrior so you won't crumble. I have heard you say time and time again that you are always prepared to die. I don't regard that feeling as necessary. I think it is a useless indulgence. A warrior should be prepared only to battle. I have also heard you say that your parents injured your spirit. I think the spirit of man is something that can be injured very easily, although not by the same acts you yourself call injurious. I believe that your parents did injure you by making you indulgent and soft and given to dwelling. The spirit of a warrior is not geared to indulging and complaining, nor is it geared to winning or losing. The spirit of a warrior is geared only to struggle, and every struggle is a warrior's last battle on earth. Thus the outcome matters very little to him. In his last battle on earth, a warrior lets his spirit flow free and clear. And as he wages his battle, knowing that his will is impeccable, a warrior laughs and laughs. I finished writing and looked up. Don Juan was staring at me. He shook his head from side to side and smiled. "You really write everything?" he asked in an incredulous tone. Genero says that he can never be serious with you because you're always writing. He's right. How can anyone be serious if you're always writing? He chuckled and I tried to defend my position. It doesn't matter, he said. If you ever learn to see, I suppose you must do it your own weird way. He stood up and looked at the sky. It was around noon. He said there was still time to start on a hunting trip to a place in the mountains. What are we going to hunt? I asked. A special animal, either a deer or a wild boar or even a mountain lion. He paused for a moment and then added, even an eagle. I stood up and followed him to my car. He said that this time we were going only to observe and to find out what animal we had to hunt. He was about to get in my car when he seemed to remember something. He smiled and said that the journey had to be postponed until I had learned something, without which our hunting would be impossible. We went back and sat down again underneath his ramada. There were so many things I wanted to ask, but he did not give me time to say anything before he spoke again. This brings us to the last point you must know about a warrior, he said. A warrior selects the items that make his world. The other day when you saw the ally and I had to wash you twice, do you know what was wrong with you? No. You had lost your shields. What shields? What are you talking about? I said that a warrior selects the items that make his world. He selects deliberately. For every item he chooses is a shield that protects him from the onslaughts of the forces he is striving to use. A warrior would use his shields to protect himself from his ally, for instance. An average man who is equally surrounded by those inexplicable forces is oblivious to them because he has other kinds of special shields to protect himself. He paused and looked at me with a question in his eyes. I had not understood what he meant. What are those shields? I insisted. What people do, he repeated. What do they do? Well, look around. People are busy doing that which people do. Those are their shields. Whenever a sorcerer has an encounter with any of those inexplicable and unbending forces we have talked about, his gap opens, making him more susceptible to his death than he ordinarily is. I've told you that we die through that gap, therefore if it is open one should have his will ready to fill it, that is, if one is a warrior. If one is not a warrior, like yourself, then one has no other recourse but to use the activities of daily life to take one's mind away from the fright of the encounter, and thus to allow one's gap to close. You got angry with me that day when you met the ally. I made you angry when I stopped your car and I made you cold when I dumped you into the water. Having your clothes on made you even colder. Being angry and cold helped you close your gap and you were protected. At this time in your life, however, you can no longer use those shields as effectively as an average man. You know too much about those forces, and now you are finally at the brink of feeling and acting as a warrior. Your old shields are no longer safe. What am I supposed to do? Act like a warrior and select the items of your world. You cannot surround yourself with things helter-skelter any longer. I tell you this in a most serious vein. Now for the first time you are not safe in your old way of life. What do you mean by selecting the items of my world? A warrior encounters those inexplicable and unbending forces because he is deliberately seeking them. Thus he is always prepared for the encounter. You, on the other hand, are never prepared for it. In fact, if those forces come to you, they will take you by surprise. The fright will open your gap, and your life will irresistibly escape through it. The first thing you must do, then, is be prepared. Think that the ally is going to pop in front of your eyes any minute, and you must be ready for him. To meet an ally is no party or Sunday picnic, and a warrior takes the responsibility of protecting his life. Then if any of those forces tap you and open your gap, you must deliberately strive to close it by yourself. For that purpose you must have a selected number of things that give you great peace and pleasure, things which you can deliberately use to take your thoughts from your fright and close your gap and make you solid. What kind of things? Years ago I told you that in his day-to-day life a warrior chooses to follow the path with heart. It is the consistent choice of the path with heart which makes a warrior different from the average man. He knows that a path has heart when he is one with it, when he experiences a great peace and pleasure traversing its length. The things a warrior selects to make his shields are the items of a path with heart. But you said I'm not a warrior, so how can I choose a path with heart? This is your turning point. Let's say that before you did not really need to live like a warrior. Now it is different. Now you must surround yourself with the items of a path with heart, and you must refuse the rest, or you will perish in the next encounter. I may add that you don't need to ask for the encounter any longer. An ally can now come to you in your sleep, while you are talking to your friends, while you are writing. For years I have truly tried to live in accordance with your teachings, I said. Obviously I have not done well. How can I do better now? You think and talk too much. You must stop talking to yourself. What do you mean? You talk to yourself too much. You're not unique at that. Every one of us does that. We carry on an internal talk. Think about it. Whenever you are alone, what do? I talk to myself. What do you talk to yourself about? I don't know, anything, I suppose. I'll tell you what we talk to ourselves about. We talk about our world. In fact, we maintain our world with our internal talk. How do we do that? Whenever we finish talking to ourselves, the world is always as it should be. We renew it, we kindle it with life, we uphold it with our internal talk. Not only that, but we also choose our paths as we talk to ourselves. Thus we repeat the same choices over and over until the day we die, because we keep on repeating the same internal talk over and over until the day we die. A warrior is aware of this and strives to stop his talking. This is the last point you have to know if you want to live like a warrior. How can I stop talking to myself? First of all, you must use your ears to take some of the burden from your eyes. We have been using our eyes to judge the world since the time we were born. We talk to others and to ourselves mainly about what we see. A warrior is aware of that and listens to the world. He listens to the sounds of the world. I put my notes away. Don Juan laughed and said that he did not mean I should force the issue, that listening to the sounds of the world had to be done harmoniously and with great patience. A warrior is aware that the world will change as soon as he stops talking to himself, he said, and he must be prepared for that monumental jolt. What do you mean, Don Juan? The world is such and such or so and so only because we tell ourselves that that is the way it is. If we stop telling ourselves that the world is so and so, the world will stop being so and so. At this moment I don't think you're ready for such a momentous blow, therefore you must start slowly to undo the world. I really do not understand you. Your problem is that you confuse the world with what people do. Again, you're not unique at that. Every one of us does that. The things people do are the shields against the forces that surround us. What we do as people gives us comfort and makes us feel safe. What people do is rightfully very important, but only as a shield. We never learn that the things we do as people are only shields, and we let them dominate and topple our lives. In fact, I could say that for mankind, what people do is greater and more important than the world itself. What do you call the world? The world is all that is encased here, he said, and stomped the ground. Life, death, people, the allies, and everything else that surrounds us. The world is incomprehensible. We won't ever understand it. We won't ever unravel its secrets. Thus we must treat it as it is, a sheer mystery. An average man doesn't do this, though. The world is never a mystery for him, and when he arrives at old age he is convinced he has nothing more to live for. An old man has not exhausted the world. He has exhausted only what people do. But in his stupid confusion he believes that the world has no more mysteries for him. What a wretched price to pay for our shields. A warrior is aware of this confusion and learns to treat things properly. The things that people do cannot under any conditions be more important than the world. And thus a warrior treats the world as an endless mystery, and what people do as an endless folly. And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.